there's been significant changes in the housing landscapes if you go back, say, 100 years. First of all, beginning at the turn of the 20th century, you had a situation where pretty much everyone rented privately in horrible conditions from, slum landlords, etc. And it was recognised that this was a problem and the government needed to intervene. The government intervened through public house building, increasing health and safety regulations, etc. That then continued after World War II in the kind of property, in the age of social housing, etc. And you also had quite significant taxes on property. Then, around about the 1950s, the conservative idea of a property-owning democracy began to emerge. And this was the idea that what we want is a society where people can have a stake in private property. And interestingly enough, they were quite explicit back then among the Conservative Party leaders about this was about eroding socialist sentiment. This is about giving people a stake in private property and sort of eroding that collective identity that social housing created. Now that sort of started in the 1950s, but obviously it didn't really kick in until Margaret Thatcher came along and really reinvented this idea. And you had things like right to buy, you had huge government intervention in order to promote this idea of a property-owning democracy. And this was really based on the kind of the myth that everyone could get this. Everyone could get a foot on the property ladder, if you like. And the incentives were skewed hugely towards home ownership in terms of taxes, which were removed, in terms of subsidies, in terms of all kinds of things that were really saying, look, we're going to push this massively, and this is the game, and everyone can get it, if they try hard enough. And for a while, that kind of worked. Home ownership increased dramatically, actually, from right up to the 1990s. House prices became so high that actually became so unaffordable that tipping point was reached, and where people began to just be priced out, particularly young people, and we've seen home ownership sort of falling and falling and falling ever since. And there's an interesting kind of political economy dynamic here because of the drive towards the property-owning democracy, you had a situation where the majority of the electorate were homeowners. So today, even 60% of people are homeowners. And in a world of democracy, you have politicians, pandering to that part of the electorate quite significantly, making policy that benefits them and not people who aren't on the property ladder. And you've seen this with repeated governments, and we saw it after the financial crisis with, the response was all about helping people get on the property market or helping people that are already on the property market. It's a really difficult situation just now politically because fundamentally what we're talking about here is large parts of the population who are benefiting from this. It's not necessarily all your aristocratic landowners, it's actually normal homeowners, here in London who've done incredibly well, who've, made millions and millions of pounds just from simply owning a home. And the reality is, which we've not yet confronted, I don't think policymakers have confronted it, is that this wealth that's been amassed, which they say is a good thing because it's, it gets people wealthy, is actually come at the expense of current and future generations who don't own property and who will see ever larger chunks of their income eaten up by higher rents or having to save more for a deposit. So I think that this is something that will, I think, as more and more people get in the private rented market and start to recognise this, will come to the fore. But I think it's just a case of that tipping point being reached and the realisation now that seems to have dawned finally on policymakers that the idea of a property-owning democracy where everyone can just, own a home and everything will be fine is really, it's really fanciful. And that means there's consequences for that, and policymakers need to wake up to that and start addressing housing availability for everyone on different tenures, on different types of housing models at an affordable level, because otherwise things are just going to keep getting worse. Well, if we go back to the early kind of pioneers of economics, of political economy, people like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, etc., they saw land as being incredibly important to the processes of the production and distribution of wealth. And they recognised that because land is a free gift of nature, it's there, nobody made it, it's fixed in supply. Once you introduce private property to that system under capitalism, landowners are in a very powerful position because they can extract income, the surplus that's being generated in society, just for the fact that they have a monopoly on a piece of space that people need to live. And so as wages go up and the economy develops, they can just take more in rent. Now, they actually worried about this, particularly the classical political economists, people like John Stuart Mill. They worried that this ability of landowners to just get rich from not doing anything could undermine the legitimacy of private property system itself. That's a system that he supported. You know, he was a capitalist, but he worried and thought that this could generate huge inequalities that will be destabilizing and people might rise up. So they sought to limit the extent to which people could make windfall gains simply from just owning land. And they were pro things like taxing that gain away and sharing the gain that arises from land values with the rest of society. Now, if you fast forward to today, I think they would be outraged, because when you look around the UK economy, wealth in the UK has increased from £1 billion, 20 years ago, to £5 billion today. But the main reason for that has been increasing house prices. So there's this idea that exists still in people's head that people get wealthy from sort of hard work, entrepreneurialism and you know, investing and things like that. And actually that's just not true. The main reason that people have got wealthy, particularly in the past 20, 30 years, is because they've bought property and house prices have risen. And they've got this windfall gain for doing very little. And the consequence of that is that that's had an impact on everyone else, because, as I said, that means that their rents will be going up. And what's really been lost, which has been there in the past, is a distinction between earned income and unearned income. Unearned income being these windfall gains that you do nothing to deserve. And the UK, if you look at the UK economy today, most of the wealth that's been created is unearned. And this is the kind of driving force in increasing inequality over recent decades. It's by people who have just been extracting wealth from doing very little. Meanwhile, people who are doing lots of work and are working very hard have been, not only are they seeing the wages decrease, but much of the wages that they are earning is then being eaten up in housing costs that are feeding unearned income for a select elite. So fixing the problem with housing is incredibly difficult. Not only working out exactly what needs to do, that's the kind of the easy bit. The hard bit is politically how to do this. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is that a number of people who are benefiting from this, as I said, aren't just a tiny number of elites. It's actually a lot of homeowners, particularly the baby boomer generation, who have done immensely well out of this, and who also happen to be the ones who tend to turn out to vote, which is why politicians often have pandered to them. But the second issue, which is equally important, is that younger generations now have seen this happen, and they've seen that it's kind of ingrained in them that what you do is you try and buy a property, and that's how you get on in life. That's how you get wealthy. People have become to feel entitled to the fact that obviously if you buy a house, obviously that house is just going to keep going up in value. And that's often encouraged by parents, because they know that they bought a house that went, you know, tripled in value. They then bought a bigger house that tripled in value, and they've done very well out of it. So there's this kind of psychological expectation that people have, which is like an entitlement, which is like, obviously house prices are going to go up and obviously I am entitled to that. And it's such a peculiarly kind of British thing. It's not something that we think that this happens everywhere, and it doesn't. So in Germany, for example, house prices to incomes have fallen over the past 30 years. Most people actually don't own a home in Germany. It's only about 30 to 40% of people actually own a home. And the idea that housing is a way that you kind of get on in life and get wealthy is kind of alien to a lot of people. It's a peculiarly British thing. And there's a question as to how do you change that? How do you go about changing that in a way which kind of avoids creating vast overnight winners and losers? Because although that might be, in theory, there's a sort of policies you could introduce which would work. Politically, you're going to create big winners and losers overnight, and that's the challenge, is how do you do this? And for me, it needs to be a long-term thing. You need to think, this is a mess, and actually it's going to take 10, 20 years for us to get away from this. What do we need to be doing over the next 5, 10, 20 years in order to phase in a number of changes which will change this system so that housing returns to being somewhere to live, not a financial asset to be speculated with or to be invested in just with the sole purpose of getting money. And it's not an easy fix, and it's something that requires strategic thinking, long-term thinking. It requires lots of people to get around the table and address this. And I think without that, I think that we're looking at potentially a pretty bleak future, I think. So there's lots of empty properties around London and the rest of the UK, and the question is, how do we, as citizens, as people in communities, how do we take that back? I think there's a number of things that you can do. One obvious thing which the government should absolutely be doing is using the taxation system to say you cannot make massive gains from simply holding on to empty property. So you can tax away these gains and keep them for the public, and you can say to them, use it or lose it effectively. But I think another thing which I think is actually a lot more interesting, which we're starting to see happen in parts of Scotland, is initiatives which enable the community in that area to actually buy out vacant and derelict land. But in order to do that, of course, you need support from the government. And what's starting to happen in Scotland is where there are derelict and empty sites and buildings, if they've been vacant for a certain amount of time, they'll be issued a compulsory sale order, which means they have to sell that because they've not been using it. And then equally on the other side, there's something set up called the Scottish Land Fund, and that means that communities can access money to therefore buy out derelict plots or vacant property in their area. And that obviously helps massively because not everyone has, spare millions of pounds lying around. So you have an enabling state which enables communities to take back control of assets which have been lying there empty, doing nothing for the community, but making millions of pounds for its owners who probably doesn't live anywhere near it and probably doesn't spend any time there. So I'd quite like to see the process of taking back a lot of these spaces back into the collective sphere through a government who's willing to support that through resources and through legislation.